There is a village in southern China, 30 miles from the great port city of Canton, where in the winter of 1814 a boy was born into a family that had very little of anything. No wealth, no land to speak of, no connections to the powerful men who ran the empire from their palaces in Beijing, thousands of miles to the north. What the family had was a belief, a fierce, unshakable belief that their youngest son was different, that the intelligence burning behind his eyes meant something, that one day, if they worked hard enough and sacrificed enough, he would pass the imperial examinations, enter the government, and lift them out of the mud they had been born into. They named him Hong Xiuquan. They had no idea what they were naming. China in the early 19th century was a world layered like sediment. At the very top sat the Qing dynasty, Manchu rulers who had swept down from the north 2 centuries earlier and planted their flag over the largest empire on earth. Below them, a vast bureaucracy of scholars and officials who ran the country through a system of examinations so rigorous and so ancient that passing them was considered the highest achievement a man could reach. And below that, hundreds of millions of ordinary people, farmers and merchants and craftsmen and teachers, living lives shaped entirely by forces they had no power to change. Hong Xiuquan was born into that bottom layer. But his village believed in him. His entire community pooled their resources to pay for his education, a collective gamble that this particular boy might be their way up. He studied the classical texts. He memorized the ancient poetry. He learned the precise, formal language of the examinations that could, if he passed them, transform him from a peasant's son into a government official overnight. He was brilliant, everyone could see it. And then he failed. The imperial examinations were held in Canton. Thousands of young men came from across the province to sit in small stone booths for days, writing essays that would be judged by examiners who held their futures in their hands. Hong Xiuquan went to Canton for the first time in his early 20s. He sat in the booth, he wrote his essays, he waited. He failed. He went home, he studied harder, he went back. He failed again. Understand what this meant. In the world Hong lived in, the examination was not just a test. It was the only door, the only legitimate path from where he was to anywhere worth going. Each failure was not just a disappointment. It was the door swinging shut a little more. The village that had sacrificed for him, waiting, his family watching, and Hong himself, brilliant and proud and utterly certain that he deserved to pass, walking home with nothing. He went back a third time. He failed again. On the journey home after his third failure, Hong Xiuquan collapsed. He was carried back to his village barely conscious, burning with fever, and he took to his bed and did not get up for 40 days. What happened to him in those 40 days, nobody who was not inside his mind can say for certain. What we know is what Hong himself described afterward. He said he had a vision. Not a dream, not a hallucination, a vision. He was taken up into heaven. He stood before an old man with a golden beard who gave him a sword and told him to slay the demons that were corrupting the world. And beside the old man stood another figure, a middle-aged man who called Hong his brother, who taught him how to fight, and who wept with him over the state of the earth below. Hong came back from those 40 days changed. He did not yet understand what he had seen. He folded the vision away inside himself, went back to teaching in the village school, and went back to Canton for his fourth examination. He failed. 6 years passed. They are quiet years in the historical record. Hong teaching, Hong failing to move forward, Hong watching younger men pass the examinations he kept failing, watching them enter the life he had been promised but could not reach. And then one day in 1843, a friend gave him a pamphlet. It had been sitting in Hong's house for years, actually. He had picked it up from a Christian missionary years before in Canton and brought it home and never read it. Now, in the flatness that followed his fourth failure, he picked it up. It was a set of Christian tracts, simple explanations of the faith written for Chinese readers, stories from the Bible translated into language ordinary people could understand. Hong read about God the Father. He read about Jesus Christ the Son. He read about demons and redemption and a heavenly kingdom to come. And something in his mind shifted like a door swinging open. He went back to the vision. The old man with the golden beard, God the Father, the middle-aged man who had called him brother and wept beside him, Jesus Christ. Hong Xiuquan sat very still for a long time. Then he understood. He was not just a failed examination candidate. He was not just a village schoolteacher from a poor family in southern China. He was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, sent to earth to slay the demons, to purify China, to establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. He believed this completely, not as a metaphor, not as a comforting story, as literal truth. And here is the thing that history keeps asking and never quite answering. Was he mad, or was he something else? Because what happened next was not what happens to a madman. What happened next was extraordinary. Hong began to preach, quietly at first in his village, to his family and his closest friends. He smashed the Confucian tablets from the school where he taught and replaced them with Christian proclamations. He baptized his cousin Feng and sent him south into the hills of Guangxi province to spread the word. And the word spread. There were reasons it spread that had nothing to do with Hong's theology. Southern China in the 1840s was a place of deep suffering. The Qing dynasty was rotting from within, weakened by the Opium Wars with Britain, humiliated by foreign powers who had forced open Chinese ports at gunpoint. The economy was fracturing. Bandits roamed the countryside. Floods and droughts had destroyed harvests across the south. Millions of people had nothing to eat and no reason to believe their government would help them. Into this world came the God worshippers. That was what Hong's followers called themselves. They gathered in the hills of Guangxi, mostly poor farmers, mostly Hakka people like Hong himself, who had always been outsiders in the south, discriminated against by the Han majority, looking for something to hold on to. They found Hong. By 1850, the God worshippers numbered in the tens of thousands. They had stopped being a religious movement and started being an army. The night of January 1st, 1851, was cold in the mountains of Guangxi. Hong Xiuquan stood before his people and proclaimed the beginning of something the world had never seen. He called it the Taiping Rebellion, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. He declared himself the Tianwang, the heavenly king, and he announced that the demons who had corrupted China, the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty, the foreign forces eating at the country's edges, the poverty and suffering of millions of ordinary people, all of it would be swept away by the army of heaven. The crowd that listened to him that night was not a mob. They were organized, disciplined, driven by a faith so total that it made them capable of things ordinary armies were not. They did not drink. They did not gamble. Men and women were kept in separate battalions. Looting was punishable by death. They moved through the countryside not like an invading army but like a holy tide. And the countryside joined them. Town after town, village after village, people who had nothing to lose and a heaven to gain threw down whatever they had and followed the heavenly king north. By the time the Taiping army reached the Yangtze River Valley, they were 1,000,000 strong. Picture what it looked like from the walls of an imperial city as the Taiping army approached. The flags first, thousands of yellow flags with characters proclaiming the heavenly kingdom. Then the sound. 1,000,000 people moving through a landscape makes a sound unlike any other. The ground trembles slightly. The air changes. Birds go silent. Then the army itself. Men and women in matching red turbans and colored sashes indicating their rank, organized into units of precise size according to a military code that Hong himself had written, based on ancient Chinese military manuals combined with his own interpretations of the Bible. Carrying weapons that ranged from ancient spears to modern rifles they had captured from imperial arsenals along the way. At the head of all of it, carried in a yellow sedan chair decorated with dragons and clouds, the heavenly king himself. City after city fell, some without a fight, some after brutal sieges that left streets running with blood. Then came Nanjing. Nanjing had been the capital of China before the Qing, a great city on the Yangtze, surrounded by walls 40 feet high and 20 feet thick, home to hundreds of thousands of people, guarded by an imperial garrison that had never faced anything like what was coming. The siege lasted 11 days. The Taiping engineers dug tunnels beneath the walls and packed them with gunpowder. On March 19, 1853, the tunnels were lit. The walls exploded. The Taiping army poured through the breach. The battle inside the city was short and total. The imperial garrison was destroyed almost entirely. The Manchu population of the city, men, women, and children, were killed. It was brutal. It was deliberate. To the Taiping soldiers, these were not civilians. They were demons, the enemies of the heavenly kingdom. Hong Xiuquan entered Nanjing and renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. He was 39 years old. He had been a failed examination candidate, a village schoolteacher, a man who collapsed in a fever and woke up believing he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And now he ruled a city of 500,000 people, commanded an army of millions, and controlled the most fertile agricultural land in China. The Qing dynasty, reeling, sent desperate messages to their allies asking for help. The world was watching. Western powers, the British and Americans and French who had their own interests in China, watched the Taiping advance with complicated feelings. On one hand, the Taiping were Christian, sort of, in a way that was difficult to categorize. They read the Bible, they worshipped the Christian God, they banned Buddhism and Confucianism and what they called idol worship. Christian missionaries who made their way to Tianjin to meet Hong Xiuquan came away deeply unsettled. Some were fascinated, others were horrified. Because Hong's Christianity was his own, uniquely, completely his own. He had added himself to the Trinity, God the Father, Jesus Christ the Son, and Hong Xiuquan, the younger brother, the heavenly king, the third divine figure through whom heaven's will would be accomplished on earth. He had written his own scriptures, hundreds of proclamations and poems and theological treatises that expanded on the Bible and corrected it where it disagreed with what God had personally told him in his visions. One visiting missionary sat with Hong and attempted to gently explain that the Bible, as written, did not mention Hong's existence. Hong listened patiently. Then he explained that God had simply not included everything. There were things God had chosen to reveal only to him. The missionary left convinced that Hong was either the most dangerous man in Asia or the most deluded, possibly both. Inside the heavenly capital, life was strange. Hong had issued proclamations covering every aspect of existence. The 10 Commandments were law. Smoking and drinking and gambling were forbidden on pain of death. Men and women lived in strict separation. The traditional Chinese family structure, where a man lived with his wife and children, was abolished. Men went to men's quarters, women to women's. Even married couples were forbidden to live together. The Taiping had their own calendar, their own system of land ownership, theoretically equal across all citizens. Their own military structure where every unit of 25 families had a religious officer responsible for Sunday worship and moral instruction, alongside a military officer responsible for training and discipline. It was, in its own terrible and fascinating way, a complete civilization, built from nothing in 3 years, governing 30 million people at its height. And at the center of it all, in a palace that grew more elaborate with every passing month, sat Hong Xiuquan. He had 88 concubines. He no longer went out. He communicated with his generals and his officials through written proclamations delivered by servants. He spent his days reading the Bible, writing his own scriptures, and receiving the visions that continued to come to him regularly. The man who had once walked the roads of southern China, with nothing was now so sacred that ordinary people could not look directly at him. His generals ran the war, and the war was extraordinary. The Taiping military commanders were some of the most talented soldiers China had produced in generations. Li Zicheng, the Shield King, was a military genius whose campaigns against the Qing armies repeatedly demonstrated that the Heavenly Kingdom could fight and win against vastly superior numbers. The imperial armies, meanwhile, were discovering that they could not defeat the Taiping with their traditional methods. The Taiping fought differently. They moved faster. They believed more completely. An army that believes it is fighting for heaven, and that death in battle is a direct path to paradise, fights in a way that purely professional soldiers cannot match. The war spread across 19 provinces. City after city changed hands. Populations fled. Armies burned what they could not hold. The Yangtze River Valley, the richest agricultural land in China, the place that fed 100 million people, became a battlefield that ground on for more than a decade. The dead accumulated in numbers too large to understand. 20 million, 30 million. Historians still argue about the precise figure. The truth is that the precise figure does not exist. There was no one counting. There was no one left in some areas to count. Villages that had existed for centuries simply ceased to exist. Cities that had held hundreds of thousands were found, when the war finally passed through, to contain almost no one. The turning point came not from outside the Heavenly Kingdom, but from within it. In 1856, Hong's most powerful general, Yang Xiuqing, did something extraordinary and fatal. Yang had always claimed a special divine authority of his own. He said that God the Father spoke directly through him, using Yang's body as a vessel. This gave Yang enormous power. Even Hong himself was expected to bow when Yang was channeling God's voice. And then Yang went too far. He summoned Hong to his presence, and speaking as God the Father, demanded that Hong elevate him to the highest rank in the kingdom, equal to Hong himself. He was, in effect, using the voice of God to blackmail the Son of God. Hong listened, then he made a decision. He sent a message to his other generals. The message was simple. Yang Xiuqing needed to be dealt with. What happened next shocked even a kingdom that had seen war and blood for 5 years. The general Wei Changhui arrived at Yang's palace in the night with an army. By morning, Yang Xiuqing and 20,000 of his followers were dead. But it did not stop there. Wei turned on other generals who might challenge him. Then Hong turned on Wei. The purge spiraled through the leadership of the Heavenly Kingdom like a fire through dry grass. When it was over, the Taiping had lost most of their best commanders. The knowledge, the experience, the relationships between units that make an army function, burned away in a single terrible season. The Qing, who had spent years unable to defeat the Taiping in the field, suddenly found that they were fighting a different army. Into this moment stepped a remarkable man on the other side. Zheng Guofan was a Confucian scholar who had watched the Taiping advance with a horror that was both political and deeply personal. The Taiping were not just rebels. They were destroyers of everything he believed in. They burned Confucian texts. They smashed temples. They had replaced the entire philosophical foundation of Chinese civilization with Hong Xiuquan's version of the Bible. Zheng built an army unlike the rotting imperial forces that had failed to stop the Taiping. He recruited from his own people, from the villages and families he knew, men who had a personal stake in the outcome. He trained them carefully and paid them reliably, two things the imperial army rarely managed. He built a river navy from scratch. He called it the Xiang Army. And slowly, with enormous patience and at enormous cost, he began to take back what the Taiping had taken. City by city, province by province, The Taiping found that the enemy they faced was different now. Zheng's forces did not break and run when the fighting turned hard. They had something to protect too. By 1862, the walls were closing in on Tianjin. Inside the heavenly capital, Hong Xiuquan had grown increasingly distant from reality. He refused to hear bad news. When generals sent reports of defeats and losses and enemy forces advancing, Hong sent back proclamations saying that God would provide, that the angels of heaven would descend to fight for the heavenly kingdom. He began to eat less. He spent more time in visions and prayer and less time governing. His generals outside the city walls were doing everything humans could do. Li Zicheng, brilliant and exhausted, fought campaign after campaign trying to break the siege of Tianjin, to push back the Qing advance, to keep the kingdom alive by sheer force of military genius. Hong told him God would help. God did not appear to send armies. In the spring of 1864, with Zheng Guofan's forces tightening around Tianjin like a fist, Hong Xiuquan fell ill. The city was running short of food. Hong, who had always eaten simply compared to what his position might have demanded, began eating wild roots and grass from the palace gardens. He told his people this was the food of heaven and they should eat it too. On June 1, 1864, Hong Xiuquan died. He was 50 years old. He had been the heavenly king for 13 years. He had been the younger brother of Jesus Christ in his own mind and the minds of millions of followers for 21 years. He died without seeing the end. 2 months later, on July 19, 1864, the walls of Tianjin fell. Zheng Guofan's forces poured into the city. What followed was a massacre. The Taiping soldiers who remained, knowing what surrender meant, fought until they had nothing left. Civilians burned their own houses rather than let the enemy take them. Groups of Taiping believers gathered together and set fire to themselves. The Qing soldiers showed no mercy, as the Taiping had shown no mercy at Nanjing 11 years before. When it was over, Zheng Guofan found Hong's body and ordered it exhumed. He had the body cremated. Then he loaded the ashes into a cannon and fired them into the sky. So that Hong Xiuquan would have no resting place. So there would be nothing for his followers to visit, to mourn over, to build a shrine around. So he would be, as completely as possible, erased. The cannon fired. The ashes scattered across the sky above Tianjin, and that was the end of the heavenly kingdom of great peace. Except that it was not quite the end. Hong's 15-year-old son briefly claimed the title of heavenly king. He escaped the city and ran. He was captured within months and executed. The remaining Taiping forces, scattered across the countryside, held out in some areas for years. Some generals refused to surrender even when it was clearly over, continuing to fight on in small, ragged bands in the mountains of southern China until there was nothing left to fight with. The war had lasted 14 years. It had consumed, by the most conservative estimates, 20 million lives. By the most expansive, perhaps 70 million. The exact number will never be known. The killing had been too widespread, too total, too ordinary in its repetition across years and provinces and cities and villages to ever be fully counted. Some provinces lost half their population. Some areas of the Yangtze Valley that had been among the most densely inhabited places on Earth were left with almost no one living in them at all. It would take generations for the region to recover. What do we make of Hong Xiuquan? He was the son of a poor family who was told by everyone around him that he was destined for greatness, and then failed, repeatedly and publicly, to achieve it. He had a breakdown so severe that it rewired something fundamental in the way he understood himself and the world. And from that breakdown he constructed a belief so total, so unshakable, so completely filling every corner of his mind, that millions of people caught fire from it. Was he a fraud? Almost certainly not. The evidence suggests he believed every word he said, completely, from the moment of his vision, until the day he died eating grass in his palace garden waiting for the angels to arrive. Was he insane? By clinical definition, almost certainly yes. But insanity on its own does not raise armies of 1 million people, does not capture one of the great cities of Asia, does not hold a kingdom together for 13 years against the full power of the Qing dynasty. There was something else in him, a quality that the historical record keeps gesturing toward but cannot quite name, a certainty so absolute that it became contagious, a vision so vivid that when he described it people felt they had been there themselves, a conviction that the world was wrong and needed to be remade, and that he was the one to remake it. He was wrong about almost everything specific. He was not the younger brother of Jesus Christ. The angels did not come. The heavenly kingdom did not usher in an era of peace. But the movement he created shook China so deeply that its aftershocks kept traveling forward through history. Sun Yat-sen, who ended the Qing dynasty 50 years later and founded the Republic of China, said he was inspired by Hong Xiuquan. Mao Zedong studied the Taiping Rebellion carefully and drew lessons from both its rise and its fall. The man who was carried home unconscious from his 4th examination failure, who lay in a fever for 40 days and woke up as someone else entirely, who marched north with an army of 1 million believers and held a kingdom for 13 years. That man did not succeed. But he changed China so completely that the China we know today is partly built on the rubble of what he destroyed and the dreams of what he tried to create. It is late now, wherever you are listening to this. The world outside is quiet. And somewhere in southern China, in a village 30 miles from Canton, there is probably nothing left to mark the place where a boy was born in 1814 to a family that believed in him completely. He failed his examinations. He fell into a fever. He woke up believing he was the son of God. And the world was never quite the same again.